we tend to idealize and hold up Western democracy as the ideal democracies, whereas in reality, they have quite a lot of flaws. Is the United States a perfect democracy? No, it is not. Billionaires have huge impact in the United States. It's not one person, one vote. It's more like $1, one vote in the United States. Industrial policy and long-term planning in China is much easier than in a lot of Western countries because they don't have to go through these political transitions that will kind of upend everything that's been done.
This is Dr. Jostein Hauge, a political economist from the University of Cambridge. He authored the book, The Future of the Factory: How Megatrends Are Changing Industrialization. Much of his research discusses the rise of China and its influence on global economics. Western media often fails to understand the truth about China. And to give you an example of what I mean, look at this headline from the New York Times entitled, "Xi is Making the World Pay for China's Mistakes." The article argues that China's manufacturing dominance is a problem for the world and that China's rise has distorted global trade. But of course, this is far from reality. The truth is the world has benefited tremendously from China's rise, most especially U.S. consumers who imported over $480 billion worth of goods from China in 2024 alone. Dr. Hauge's response to this article hits the mark perfectly. This essay falls into the line of growing anti-China sentiments in the U.S., trying to portray China as the boogeyman. In reality, all we can blame China for is challenging U.S. economic hegemony. In today's show, we'll debunk the myth of China's overcapacity, discuss China's role in the World Trade Organization, and explain how China is on pace to account for 45% of global industrial production by 2030. In today's episode, you will learn how China became the fastest growing auto manufacturer and how China's renewable energy sector gives hope to the world. If you truly want to understand the truth about China, then this is the episode for you. Let's begin. Professor, thank you so much for joining us here on Real Talk.
It's great to be here. Thank you.
Fantastic. I want to start off our conversation because I know that you tweet a lot about China, and this is really interesting to me because you have a number of tweets that are very supportive of China's economic transformation. And as a political economist, why is China's transformation important to you? But also, what do you think that the world misunderstands about China?
Well, I think, first of all, if you look at the transformation that China has gone through in the past few decades, from the perspective of someone who does development economics, it's just simply remarkable. Going from a country that was just a few decades ago quite poor, and now, although its GDP per capita isn't super high, it's grown quite a lot, it's quite high, but China is now a leader in several global industries. They've lifted more people out of poverty than the rest of the world put together in the last 50 years, leading renewable energy manufacturing. And, I can mention a lot more things. So just from the perspective of economic development and studying economic development is just very remarkable.
Yeah, I love your tweet that you sent out. You had even mentioned that, for example, China has a higher life expectancy in the compared to the United States, despite its income per capita being roughly 1/6 of the United States. I thought that's quite an amazing statistic as well.
Yeah, for sure. That's something very remarkable. I'm not sure. Does that say more about China? Does that say more about the health system in the United States? Having that kind of growth in life expectancy, despite having such low income, says something about also how resources are efficiently allocated in China.
Yeah, it's very interesting. I mean, because I'm from the United States. We certainly have, I would say, we have a healthcare industry here, not really a healthcare system. It's very much profit driven. Unfortunately, I think the United States has one of the worst healthcare systems. It's not, for what we pay, it's not the best. And so I think there's certainly things we can learn from other countries. Another point that you put in was just how China has been, providing the world with affordable goods. And I kind of want to transition now to, this trade war that we're looking at. This is going to be the talk of 2025. Obviously, Donald Trump first started this trade war back in 2018. And now here we are with Trump 2.0. We're looking at an expanded trade war. From your perspective, Professor, tell us a little bit more about the economics and what you're looking, at this, specifically the trade war between U.S. and China.
One of the, most important traded goods in the world is manufactured goods. In theory and in practice, all manufactured goods can be traded, right? In China, this is really an economic area where China has made a huge inroad. Some people call China the factory of the world, right? And China basically has a foot in the production of everything, all manufactured goods in the world, right? And they become so dominant that the United States feels economically threatened by China. I guess it wasn't so much of a problem when China, was doing assembly, specializing in low-tech goods, and for the most part helping U.S. transnational corporations in their operations. But now you're seeing China making entries into semiconductors, into artificial intelligence, and also starting to erode some of this manufacturing base in the United States, and also the industrial centers of the United States are more severely declining. So this trade war is in large part a war about manufactured goods, and the United States now trying to solve this trade deficit they've had for a long time, and also trying to rebuild some of the capabilities that they've lost in the manufacturing sector.
Yeah, that's a great point. And I think interesting, in Western media, we have this term called overcapacity. This is a term that's been very hot over the last 12 to 18 months. We hear a lot of US politicians talk about this. I want to bring up a tweet that you had sent, and this is really interesting because we have the Wall Street Journal here, talking, okay, China's economy is burdened by years of excess. Here's how bad it really is. And, you kind of call them out on this. You say, now we are calling it overbuilding, overcapacity, excess production. I guess this is exactly what you were talking about with the West trying to cope with China's rise as a manufacturer.
Yes. Let me start by saying a lot of my posts and tweets on China of that nature is also because you see a kind of narrative building up, especially in the West, about China, China being quote unquote bad, right?
Right.
When the way I see it is that this anti-China rhetoric that is building up is in some part simply because China is turning out to be economically challenging some countries. But as a whole, for global prosperity, actually, China has been quite beneficial. Now, on this issue of overcapacity and overproduction is an example of this, right? So I study economic development and I know the history of economic development. And if you study the history of economic development, you see that countries that have grown rapidly and succeeded in eliminating poverty within their borders, they have relied on exporting a lot of goods, producing more than what is domestically needed, right? That's what we call export-led development. And this is the path that China has been on, and it's been termed export-led development for many years.
Right.
Now suddenly we hear these other terms coming in as China increasingly becomes, an economic threat to the United States, especially in the United States. They call it overcapacity or overproduction. I think the renewable energy sector is the best example of this. We clearly need more renewable energy.
Right.
Even with all the renewable energy devices that China is producing, we don't have enough. How is it possible that China's production in EVs and solar panel is at overcapacity when we clearly need more of that?
I want to kind of simplify this as well because, for example, I think overcapacity is a very basic economic thought here. For example, in your home country of Norway, right, you produce more salmon than Norwegian could possibly eat, right? You have an overcapacity of salmon, which is why you export it around the world and why we find Norwegian salmon in our grocery market, in our grocery stores here in the United States, right? Apple produces much more iPhones than the United States could possibly consume, and hence why they export them around the world. Is it really as simple as that? Just looking at this economic-led development?
I think you're spot on. I haven't studied all, the subsectors in details in China, and it might be possible, or you might convince me that there is overproduction or overcapacity in some economic activities.
Right.
But this idea that because China exports products to other markets, this idea that is overcapacity is just rubbish, right? This idea that China is flooding other markets with their products is a misleading idea, okay? Other markets, other countries buy goods from China because they get relatively high quality goods that are at a relatively good price, both consumers and firms using goods from China as inputs, right? So it's a lot about the words that are being used here, right? Such as overcapacity or flooding overseas market with their goods. Right. China is simply doing things pretty efficiently and pretty cheaply, and they're being very good at competition.
Yeah, absolutely. Great point here. I want to bring up this one. I think this is quite interesting when you just say the US-China trade war explained in one chart. And I think this really highlights that when we look at, as early, if we look on the far left, this is 2003. We could see that the share of global manufacturing, United States was the leader, approximately, let's call it 22, 23%, China just over 10%. But what we've seen in the last, 2 decades, obviously, China rising very rapidly in the United States, still obviously manufacturing a lot, but certainly having their share of a global manufacturing decline. This is, certainly explains a lot of the U.S.-China trade war. What do you think this graph will continue to look like in the future? Are we going to continue to see China, expanding and owning more of that global manufacturing base?
Yes. So I do some work with the UN Industrial Development Organization, and they project that China's share of global manufacturing in 2030 will be roughly 35%. So that's 5 percentage points higher than it is now. It's hard to say, exactly when that growth will stop, but there's reason to believe that China's share of global manufacturing will continue to grow for a few years.
That's excellent. I want to look at this, another tweet that you sent out. And this is, I think, a very interesting part of this argument as well, is that China's share of exports going to the United States is actually decreasing. And now we're going to go tie this right back into Donald Trump. We say that because of this, further U.S. tariffs on China will hurt the Chinese economy less compared to Trump's first term. Have we kind of seen a strategic shift away from China, as far as not sending as many goods to the United States, or have they just been expanding their other trading partners? Is that really why we've seen that chart really start to decline?
A little bit of both, actually. And if you looked at the United States, you see something a bit similar. I think both countries have tried to become a little bit less dependent on each other. And this is a move that we've seen in the global economy, especially since the pandemic, that countries are being more strategic about who they partner up with in terms of trade. But China has so many trading partners right now, and a lower share of their exports is going to the United States, a lower share of imports as well. Tariffs on China, I'm not sure if it's going to hurt China as much as Trump would intend for it to hurt. Now, I don't think we've seen, as we're having this conversation, kind of the full extent of how this is going to play out. We've seen that Trump has, applied tariffs and then revoked them immediately after with what he's done with Mexico and Canada. I'm not entirely sure how this kind of second or third or trade war between the US and China will play out right now. But indeed, you're correct. I don't think China is as dependent on the United States as an end market for their exports as they were during Trump's first term.
Yeah, I think Trump is very much very unpredictable. I don't know if anybody can really, predict exactly what he's going to do. I think it's very interesting to see this development where Trump initially said we're going to put in tariffs of 25% on two of America's closest allies. I mean, really, putting that tariff on Canada would have been a disaster. Obviously, it's been paused for 1 month. What are your thoughts on that when you see, for example, from Norway, studying it, a professor at Cambridge University, studying economics? I mean, from your position, how is Europe and even yourself, how are you looking at that when Donald Trump says, we're going to be passing these tariffs on our allies? What do you think?
That's a really, this is a really interesting topic. Trump's approach to tariffs and trade policy, right?
Right.
Now, I want to first say that Trump kind of started this idea of increased protectionism in his first term. Mm-hmm. And Biden did continue it to some degree. He did put tariffs on China with EVs. He's also put a range of export restrictions and sort of restricted trade practices and policies in the US semiconductor industry. But I think Trump right now, as you said, he is a bit of an unpredictable person. The way I've understood Trump so far is that he uses tariffs as a negotiating tool. It's not necessarily an economic incentive for the United States. And a lot of people have pointed out that Trump's will be damaging for the United States, and that could very well be the case.
Right.
But it seems like it's more of a bargaining tool that he uses when it comes to issues like immigration and fentanyl, right? Those have been his issues with Mexico and Canada, to try and get them to do what he wants in terms of border control. Tariffs is definitely something that Trump likes. He may be unpredictable in terms of his practices and ideology, but Trump and tariffs seem to go hand in hand.
Yeah, he's definitely. I mean, we've seen tariffs in the United States. Interesting. They've been increasing with every president that has gone by. Donald Trump did pass a record number of tariffs during his first term. I believe it was around 2,000 per year. And then I believe that actually Joe Biden increased that. He was also not afraid to use the tariffs. But I like that insight that you shared, though, that it's more of a tool as opposed to really the economics of that, because it would have been a disaster for the United States and Canada. Obviously, it's still not in the clear. We might see what Donald Trump does in a few weeks' time if he wants to reapply that pressure and get what he wants from Canada. But I do want to shift here to the World Trade Organization. I think this is really interesting because in the United States, we have a lot of politicians, and I would say more on the Republican side, more of the China hawks that are very aggressive towards China. They have said that, China joining the World Trade Organization was a massive mistake. And I wanted to share this tweet that you sent out. I think this is quite fascinating when, you said, like, we're looking at the industrial production and how in the United States, it basically started declining almost exactly when China joined the World Trade Organization. And you really highlight that this is the importance of international trade agreements. Can you kind of expand upon exactly what this chart means and what you mean with the trade agreements?
Yeah, so I should be a little bit more technical when it comes to this chart in particular, and be clear that industrial production as share of the economy, or manufacturing as share of the economy in the United States, started decreasing before that.
Right.
The kind of move towards the service economy. This chart shows it in kind of in nominal terms. So in absolute numbers, industrial production was going up until that time. But that chart, I thought it was really interesting because you see that the growth in industrial production, absolute numbers, start kind of decreasing right after China joined the World Trade Organization. And, as we know, China as a player in the international arena, in international trade, economically has been very important. And it was especially after China joined the World Trade Organization that they started becoming a much bigger player in international trade, because that enabled them to trade much more easily with a lot of partners, or with essentially all countries in the world, because by now almost all countries in the world are members of the World Trade Organization. But I want to, when we talk about the World Trade Organization, I want to say something important here. And the United States has had a lot of control over the World Trade Organization for many years, and sometimes defied the rules of the World Trade Organization without consequences, right?
Correct.
And I think what the United States is especially upset seeing now is that China is taking a page from the book of the United States and also doing things a bit on their terms, right? They're saying now we're also a global superpower. We can also do, trade policy and industrial policy in a clever way, like you can do.
Yeah, I think that's a really good insight there. And I'm going to follow that with, looking at a specific industry. I think this was a really fascinating chart. And again, I love your Twitter. I think it's, a fascinating place. We're going to put those links so people can follow you. But, let's just look at the car industry, for example. This is quite a fascinating one where, we look back in 1998, China accounted for 1.4% of global car production. Fast forward, just over 25 years, and that has increased to 38.4%. I mean, that is an incredible, dramatic change. I mean, almost going from, basically a nobody controlling 1% to now almost 40%. Break that down for us, as far as China's automobile industry and, what that really means for over the last, few decades of economic development.
That is absolutely mind-boggling, that growth. And, for those of us manufacturing nerds, that is absolutely a mind-boggling growth in such a short time frame. We should, it's important to note that this is not visible in all markets in the world, right? We don't see in the United States or in most countries in Northern Europe, we don't see 40% of cars on the roads being Chinese brands.
Correct.
But the fact that of all the cars that are produced right now in the world, 40% of them are Chinese brands. And that's, grown from practically nothing from 20, 30 years ago. That is very impressive. And I want to highlight in particular electric vehicles, because this is a market that China is really starting to take over now. And I predict that, 5, 10, 15 years down the line, in most countries in the world, we'll start seeing Chinese brands in the EV market. That is, of course, unless there are severe trade restrictions, who knows what's going to happen in this new era of trade wars between countries. But China is really surging in the electric vehicle market, and especially BYD. What they're doing with electric vehicles in China is extremely impressive.
Oh, it really is. And I mean, when you go to China, I think what's so amazing to see is the transformation. I mean, I first went to China in 2007, and obviously at that time, there was no electric vehicles. It was all gas, and there was so much pollution, in combination with factories as well. But I believe that has shifted so much now. When I return to China every summer, 50% of the cars on the roads are electric vehicles. That has had a substantial change to the pollution, but also just the quality of life, I think, in China as well. And I think, like you said, we need more electric vehicles, right? We need a better, renewable energy. I mean, the world needs more of that. And so I think this is definitely something that we should be celebrating, from China, that they're continue to advance this industry. What's also interesting, they've really brought Elon Musk and Tesla very much into that ecosystem. Obviously, Tesla, has the Gigafactory in Shanghai. 55% of every Tesla in the world is coming from Shanghai. So, even if you're, proud American and you want to buy a Tesla, it's still, coming from China, and it's still very much involved in that ecosystem.
To hear you say that 50% of electrical vehicles in China, that's extremely impressive. And this is also hearing this as a development economist, because we look at these figures like GDP per capita, right? And we see that China is classified as still as a middle income country. But then you hear about the high-speed rail networks, about how many electric vehicles you see on the streets, about now, artificial intelligence and DeepSeek, right? So in a lot of ways, China is defying conventional wisdom in economics by, they're on the one hand this middle income country, but then on the other hand, at the technological frontier in so many ways. It's very impressive.
That's a good point that you brought up, because I think that is a very fascinating statistic. The fact that we see the income per capita, it is much smaller than the United States. When you technically classify it is still a developing country. But yet we look at these industries, like you said, AI. I mean, the new DeepSeek tool, AI tool that's now fully open source, completely changed the future of AI. We see the high-speed rails. We see we live in a society in China where there's everything's digital, right? Everything's run through your phone. There's no cash. Everything's very advanced over that. Is there any specific reason why that happened? Like, how is that possible that China is this anomaly, that it's able to, develop some of the most advanced industries in the world, despite not having that super high income that economists said is necessity to develop?
Well, I think maybe you can even answer that to some degree better than me, having spent so much time in China.
Right.
But obviously, I think we should keep in mind that China is a very big country, right? When you see GDP per capita, and say GDP per capita in China is around $14,000, something like that, and then GDP in the United States is $60,000, $70,000, $80,000, right? If you go to a city like Shanghai, then that's one part of China, right? And obviously there's going to be a lot more wealth in Shanghai, and Shanghai will probably come across as a city similar to the really developed cities in North America or in Northern Europe, right? And other areas of China not as affluent, right? So I think because of the size of the country, we also need to think a bit about the disparity when we think about these numbers, right?
That's a great point. Actually, I think if you were to go to the Shanghai, Beijing, Shenzhen, Guangzhou, that's the big four, the top four cities, I think you would see that GDP per capita be substantially higher and certainly representative of those industries. But I will go ahead and answer that question, as from my perspective, at least, is having lived in China for many years and traveling there every year. I think a lot of it does come down to the economic priority, for the government, and really the planning. And I think that, I'm certainly not here trying to say that, China's government's amazing, we should follow their plan, but I always like to observe as from the outside looking, okay, how is China planning? What are they doing? You're probably very familiar with the fact that, the government comes out with a 5-year plan every 5 years for the country. And I was amazed at, 1 year, one of the bullet points was, we want to increase the life expectancy of our citizens. I thought, wow, what an amazing plan from the government, to make that a national objective. And how are we going to do that? We're going to reduce pollution. We're going to, improve the quality of the air for our citizens. We're going to put in measures like reducing smoking in public areas to reduce secondhand smoke and work on these initiatives. So I do think that while China's government certainly has its own issues and problems, I do think that there is always something to learn. And I think that's something that I really want to make people help understand.
This is very interesting to listen to you and listen to your insights here. On the planning aspect, I saw a prominent journalist recently post on X/Twitter that we see that industrial policy and long-term planning in China is much easier than in a lot of Western countries, because they don't have to go through these political transitions that will kind of upend everything that's been done, right?
Right.
And obviously that was hinting at a discussion about democracy. And I think democracy is something in itself that all countries should strive to achieve. Democracy here being, leadership that is accountable to its people and it's formed by the people, right? At the same time, I do think we tend to idealize and hold up Western democracy as the ideal democracies, whereas in reality, they have quite a lot of flaws, right?
Right.
Is the United States a perfect democracy? No, it is not. Billionaires have huge impact in the United States. It's not one person, one vote. It's more like $1, one vote in the United States. China is obviously not a democracy. But to say that China should go to where Germany is or Norway is or where the United States is in terms of democracy, that is also the wrong approach, I think.
I completely agree with you. And that's more on the topics that I like to focus on. And one thing I always say is the world is too unique and too diverse for only one form of government to exist. And I think also, to highlight on that point you mentioned with the scale of China, it's very hard to imagine what 1.4 billion people look like. That's 4 United States together in one place. And in addition to that, you have a country like China that is very diverse. In my home country of the United States, you can go everywhere and speak English. In China, there's over 300 different dialects. You start traveling around China, you will find people that don't actually speak Mandarin because they speak their local language. And it's so unique and it's so diverse. I always equate traveling through China as almost like going to another continent, because it has this whole ecosystem. It's very unique, and there's just so many different cultural elements within China alone. And I think you're not going to experience that or really have any knowledge of that until you go to China and really learn about that. For example, we have a very simplistic mindset. That's China. They speak Chinese. It's a lot more it's a lot more complex than that. So I do think that they're going to have a different form of government, one that is suitable, and certainly some accountability, for the people, but also to understand just how diverse the people are, how diverse the regions are, and the different needs and wants of the people as well. It's, again, a very interesting thing to be an American, observing how that country functions and how do you take care of 1.4 billion people.
I completely agree with you. And this is maybe something to keep in mind for those who listen to who subscribe to your YouTube channel, for those who are, in the West and in Europe or in North America and haven't necessarily traveled that much, that some places in the world, even within countries, are extremely diverse in terms of dialects, food, languages, culture, right? You mentioned China. You're very familiar with China. In many ways, India, right? You have different languages in each region in India. That's a place I've traveled a few times. And a lot of people mistakenly think that English is the first language of many people from India. That's not the case. Right. First, they speak the dialect or the language of the region, then Hindi, right, which is the official language of the country, and then English as a third language, right? And most people, if you go to the countryside, won't speak English. So this kind of, I think, for those of us in a bubble in North America or Europe, we sometimes tend to forget about this enormous within-country diversity in other countries in the world.
No, that's very good. I love these insights. I love our conversation today, Professor. I want to get one final tweet I do want to share. I think this is a really fascinating one. where it just talks about this chart of China's tech industrial ecosystems. And this is interesting from the economic perspective. Most of us economists don't understand that clusters of technological capabilities cut across our categories of sectors and industries. And this chart really does show quite a lot about China. I think when you start looking at how many industries are crossing over, again, we always thought of China as this, place where you manufacture cheap goods. That was certainly the stereotype for many years, certainly when I was growing up. But I think now what this chart really shows is, how vast the manufacturing is and just how advanced it's become, hasn't it? It's really become this, now a place to manufacture the most advanced things like, for example, an iPhone or something like that.
First, when you show that post, I need to shout out Kyle Chan,
Yes.
who made that chart. So Kyle is a friend and also an academic at Princeton University, and he knows a lot about industrial policy in China. So do follow him on Twitter and follow his Substack, where that chart was from. I was a researcher in the engineering department at Cambridge for a few years, actually, at a place called the Institute for Manufacturing as an economist. And because I study things like industrial policy and manufacturing from an economic perspective, and a lot of the engineers were puzzled that a lot of us economists have this distinct categories between manufacturing and services, for example, because for them, a lot of it intertwines. And for them, they will see technological clusters going across different sectors of the economy, right? So it's not necessarily about the car industry, but more about, from a technological perspective, the battery industry and the companies and the technologies that are involved in that. And that again fizzles into a range of so-called industries or at least industries that as economists classify as industries. So, I thought that chart by Kyle from a company perspective captured really well a bit of the messiness of how technological development happens, and that technological clusters aren't very easy to identify, at least not as easy as most economists would have.
No, that's a fantastic insight, and thank you so much for sharing your perspective. I think it's great as certainly an economist and someone that studies this, and thank you for your work that you're doing. And I also want to talk about your book, though. We're going to end on this one. Last question is you've authored a book called "The Future of the Factory: How Megatrends Are Changing Industrialization." Tell us a little bit more about the book that you've published and what our viewers could expect from reading that book.
Yeah, so this book basically goes through transformations in the global economy that are impacting the world of manufacturing from an economic perspective, and also industrialization trajectories and industrial policy. So these megatrends, I talk about the rise of services, I talk about automation, I talk about the globalization of production, and I talk about ecological breakdown. And on the one hand, I highlight, one of the key highlights here of the book is that manufacturing continues to be really an integral part of economic growth and development, and will continue to be so. And if we needed any sort of reminder of this, what we're seeing between China and the United States is proof here. And this happened after I wrote the book, but we're seeing this play out year by year. Another important message of the book is that when it comes to figuring out which countries are going to be able to industrialize or not industrialize, we need to look at power dynamics in the world economy. When we look at these global value chains in manufacturing, we see that developing countries occupy a relatively small share of value with what they do. So I think a key challenge here, is to figure out a way for those of us who care about international development, how developing countries can industrialize, how we can construct global governance systems to allow developing countries to more actively embark on industrial policy. And this is also part of the reason why, a lot of my posts have been supportive of China, because you're seeing a developing country here, really successfully doing this, and building up, a huge economy that benefits a lot of its people.
Yeah, fantastic. I do have one final question, though. I'd ask this to all my guests. What is one thing that you want the world to know about China?
One thing that I'd like for the world to know about China? Well, one fact that I think is important for everyone right now to know about China is they are the global leader in renewable energy manufacturing. If you look at solar panels, if you look at windmills, if you look at lithium batteries, China is the leader. Right now, we need to urgently deal with the climate crisis, and we should applaud China's efforts in renewable energy manufacturing to get us there. Of course, China has, they can do things more efficiently with respect to their own energy production, but China is really showing us the way in renewable energy manufacturing.
Everyone, thank you for spending time with me here on YouTube. I'm so honored to have the chance to interview world-class guests like Dr. Jostein Hauge and help share his positive message and insights to the world. If you enjoyed today's episode, make sure you give him a follow on Twitter and also subscribe to my geopolitics newsletter. I'll drop the link to both of those in the description down below. Finally, if you're interested in learning more about China, make sure you click here to watch our next video. And once again, I want to thank you all for your continued support, and I look forward to seeing you all in our next video soon.